I think we live in the greatest time in history for wine because, we have access to all of these wines that even 30 or 40 years ago, we had no idea that they even existed.
Sit back and grab a glass. It's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today in Southern California, beautiful 70 degrees today. And we are out in New York talking to the New York Times wine critic, Eric Asimov. Wine Talks is available, of course, at Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, you name it, we are there. And always sponsored by the Original Wine of the Month Club, now supporting the Bordeaux, Napa, and Sweet Wine series. But that's not why we're here. We have Eric Asimov on the line. He is, we were just discussing, he is a James Beard Award nomination for wines and spirits and other beverages, as well as beverage and food. And it looks like, and we were just discussing this or debating, where they actually won the award for the James Beard Foundation Award for Who's Who of Food and Beverage. But regardless, welcome to the show, Eric. I'm excited to talk to you.
Nice to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me.
So this is, I hate to say it, it's 70 degrees here. And, the sun was coming up over the mountains here in Southern California. And I think, 18 in New York right now?
About 25 now, midday.
Oh, just kind of got up to 25. That's great. So... I've been watching and reading some of your stuff, and I'm fascinated to have this conversation. I want to talk about wine. I want to talk about food. I want to talk the evolution of food in New York, as well as the rest of the...
Anything you want.
This is a great subject, isn't it? I mean, this is tough work, right? We get to talk about our favorite stuff.
I always say never trust a wine or food critic who complains about the job.
Well, that's a valid thing.
There's so many who want you to know how hard it is, how often they have to go to restaurants, how many meals they have to eat, how many bottles they have to open. Come on, it's like the best job in the world if you're suited to it.
It's a fascinating subject, for one. If you're interested in the academia of either subject, food or wine, there's plenty to study. As well, I had I had an associate in another industry tell me just the other day, he goes, "Man, I wish I had your job." And I have to look at my wife, who works here as well. She's the accountant here, and I'm like, I think he's right. I think we're pretty fortunate to be doing this and to be able to meet people, to travel the world. So speaking of that, you were just off a webinar. Was that yesterday about the climate change in the wine industry?
Yes, I was watching it, and there's some familiar wine people. Greg Jones from Linfield University in Oregon, and Dan Petrosky at Larkmead were talking about climate change, which, even though in wine we have more immediate issues with the pandemic and wine tariffs and so on, climate change is still the existential crisis that overhangs everything we do.
It's interesting because I've had conversation. I just got off the call last week with Frédéric Barnier and Cyril Siroux of Chateau de Jacques, and it seems different regions of the world it's hitting more prolifically, and particularly Burgundy. Bordeaux seems to have some issues, and they brought in some new grapes. We'll talk about that. But where did it look like climate change was affecting the wine world most?
Well, I've been looking at wine and climate change for, almost 20 years now. And wow. I think the real impact was first felt in the areas that we used to call marginal climates. In the Northern Hemisphere, we would talk about the Mosel region of Germany, Champagne, wow. Burgundy, all areas that, in which every year you were just hoping you could ripen the grapes sufficiently. Mm-hmm. And when climate change first started to be felt, it was, in fact, a great thing for these regions. The Langhe is another area.
Oh
And
yeah.
so suddenly, in the 70s, when you might have 2 years in a decade where you couldn't ripen the grapes, and maybe 2 years which might be considered great vintages, and then the rest were kind of mediocre. Suddenly, year after year, you were having wonderful vintages. That was true in the Langhe in the 90s. Um, Champagne was like that, Burgundy, and it just kind of changed the dynamic and made success a lot easier.
Well,
Now
certainly.
it's gone
Go
over
ahead.
the edge.
Well, certainly, it's done some interesting things, like allowed sparkling wine in England, to be
Yes,
palatable and
yes.
successful. Is there any conversation? And I'm not. This is not a political show, so I'm not interested in getting that direction. But is there any conversation about the mini ice age, for instance, that affected Champagne in the 17, late 18, early 1800s, and that's just this is sort of a swapping of that, and now we're dealing with early
Uh,
ripening
no,
grapes and things like that.
I don't think so. I mean, not if you're going to have a serious conversation about
Yeah.
climate change. And unfortunately, it's hard not to be political, and I don't think we should shy away from that. Uh, the fact that humans were causing our current changing of the climate
Hmm.
and causing it to happen far faster than ever in recorded history is beyond a doubt. And it only became a debate because uh, uh, people like Koch Industries financed so-called think tanks to promote an alternative point of view and therefore make it political.
That's interesting. So 20 years you've been looking at this, and how when you started studying it, you started to study it for a reason that must have piqued your interest. And then how's it dramatically changed, or how's it changed in the last 20 years that you've seen now through all these
Well,
conversations and
you know,
study?
I think the political aspects are important because if you go back to the 90s, it was kind of it was accepted science that the climate was changing, and it was not
Hmm.
a matter of political party. It was kind of consensus that something might need to be done. There wasn't the sense of urgency at the time, but essentially we've lost 25 years, and now we're in a situation where we've got to do something before it's too late.
Seems rather dramatic when you think of a place like Bordeaux, bringing on Touriga Nacional and some other, not say less popular grapes to test and allow inside the blends. I think that's fascinating. But I had a question for Cyril Charouz of Chateau des Jacques, and the question was this: if we're harvesting a little earlier, right? So climate change is warming things up. We have a degree or two changes. We need to canopy the grapes differently to cool them, but we're still going to pick them a little earlier than we did. And I was trying to figure out if a ripe grape, uh, which is now being picked maybe a month earlier in some cases, a phenologically ripe grape, is that a different grape than it would have been if it lasted a little longer on the vine, a little slower to mature? And is there a difference in the phenolic ripeness of the grape? Is there any
Um,
discussion?
well, obviously, he would have a better way of answering
Well,
it than I would. But from what I understand, it there's a lot that goes into the growing season that is going to affect the final product. And part of the farmer's challenge is to stretch that growing season out. And how you prune the vines, how you trellis them, how you manage the canopy. All of these things go into the formula of whether you're going to have a balanced crop at the end of the year, and a crop that's ripe in all the ways you would want it to be, rather than just measuring sugar.
Do you think, I had a conversation with some Canadian podcasters, wine podcasters, and, we know the Niagara Peninsula and places like that, but they're Ontario-based sort of guys, and they're talking about some red varietals that they're growing. And I've been to Millbrook, New York during the dead of the winter and watching people prune, the vines in 3 feet of snow. Is the climate change advanced wine growing in America to regions that, typically was, like he said, marginalized?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, I think that it affects, all sorts of areas, but places like Ontario, sometimes it's hard to measure it just in terms of latitude, because places like the Finger Lakes and the Niagara Peninsula are able to grow vinifera grapes because they have that lake effect, in which the body of water will absorb heat and protect the vines during the winter from freezing, and keep them from getting too hot in the summer. Might be places like Prince Edward Isle that have been more affected by climate change. Certainly Scandinavia, where people like Klaus Peter Keller are now planting vinifera vineyard.
Wow.
That would have been
That's
impossible.
amazing.
And of course,
Yeah.
England is the perfect example. And one of the interesting things about wine is that it really is kind of a canary in the coal mine for climate change, because grapes are so exquisitely sensitive to every nuance of change in the climate. And that's why you have people in Bordeaux experimenting with grapes, or even in Napa Valley, not because they're not going to be able to plant Merlot over the next 10 years, but because they're really looking 50 and 100 years ahead from now, which is what wine people have to do. That's the life of a vineyard. And if you're gonna plan for your future, if you're in a family enterprise and you want your grandchildren to be able to continue what your grandparents were doing, that's how you've got to think. But it's not really just when you harvest the grapes. It's we've talked for forever about the great southern facing vineyards on hillsides in the northern hemisphere, and now suddenly northern facing vineyards are becoming more valuable because they're not so super exposed to the sun. What does that mean to a place like Hermitage? What will its relationship be to Saint Joseph, where you have vineyards facing more southeast or east? It's fascinating to think of what's going to happen. Aside from the the economic challenges that everybody's going to be facing.
Well, you touched on a lot of really interesting points, and I hadn't thought about the direction of which the hills facing which way and what that does to the grapes. And we want, it has a lot to do with the value of the grape depending on its exposure to the sun. And it kind of makes you think it's farming. The winemakers are farmers, and they want to extract from the soil and from their region the best they can. And so to look that far out is pretty amazing and pretty intellectual to have to predict based on some of these changes in the climate and to adapt to that. If it's changing the grapes or how you trellis or how you make wines, or it's going to change the face of wine. I was fascinated by the Bride Valley Sparkling Rosé a few weeks ago. I tasted on a show, and I was like amazed. In fact, I'd found my father's notes from 1988 when he visited the Isle of Wight for strictly a wine tour, all German varietals at that point, right? Which makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
And now we're growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and in Dorset. I mean, it's fascinating.
Those English sparkling wines can be wonderful. And,
Excellent.
30 years
Excellent.
ago, I mean, it basically didn't exist.
No. Is that part of your regular regiment? Just not the English wines necessarily, but sparkling wines? Because I'm learning that this is a great opportunity to just enjoy champagne or cava or prosecco or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think sparkling wines, like all other genres, have been, they've had an explosion in the last 25 years or so, where wines that you might have dismissed, cava or Zec from Germany. 10 years ago, Petnat was, nobody really understood what that was.
Right.
That term, and now they're everywhere.
Yes. The challenge of climate change is real, and it's important, and we need to adapt and change. And then we pile on a COVID that has, and I read your last article about it, and I see it live here every Tuesday when I taste wines, has really wreaked havoc. And then we had fires in Napa. So I mean, they've just been piled on these folks in this industry, and I'm not sure about New York, but it's got a domino effect to not only the wine industry, but obviously the restaurant industry has been devastating. We'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things that just happened here, because of COVID, there's been a lot of consolidation because these guys can't survive. I don't know. The margins suck, right? So we're in this industry where the margins are terrible, and a distributor can't go 4, 6, 12 months without the 80% on-premise sales that they were getting. And so there's been a consolidation of distributors. We were already sort of in a declining mode anyway. So we're going from 700 and down to 400, down to 300. And all of a sudden it's all Southern and Young's and, RDC or whatever. How has that been in New York? What's been the fallout in the wine side because of the restrictions put on the restaurants and COVID?
Well, the fallout for wine, I mean, it's just horrible. Restaurants, aside from everything that we love about restaurants, they are also the single most important promotional vehicles for wine in a place like New York. Where you have so many sommeliers. This is another thing that maybe didn't exist 25 years ago. You might have been able to count the number of sommeliers on one hand who worked in fancy French restaurants. Now every corner bistro, every place has its wine expert, or had, because we don't know what things are going to look like after the pandemic. But these people were the foremost advocates for different sorts of wines, introducing the public to, if you go back 20 years, nobody ever heard of Gruner Veltliner. Then it became quite popular. Why? Because restaurants promoted it. Different Rieslings from around the world, Assyrtiko, Sicilian wines, all of these wines, the wines from the Jura that have become coveted. It's very much because of the work of wine directors and sommeliers and restaurants. And when that is taken, that part of the formula is taken away, it hurts the wine business. The tariffs have been incredibly damaging to small businesses, and sadly, if they continue, they're going to contribute to consolidation. And
the Bordeaux are getting clobbered. The price, these poor vendors. This kind of why I brought this up is on Tuesday, and I have wonderful French and Italian vendors. This single one person. They travel to Europe. They buy their own wines. They bring them to America. They store them at a local warehouse. They logistically use somebody else. The margins are not good, but they do it because they love it and the passion for bringing their sort of own country's wines into America. And what happened with COVID, since no restaurants were buying, these little distributors were out of business. And then one of the big guys, Southern bought up one of the great local distributors called Epic Wines, source of great Burgundy and some offbeat Italians and things. And they're gone. And so,
do you think Southern is going to give the same attention to those wines, market them with the same amount of passion? And no,
it's the only. This is the problem. You and I can walk into a restaurant, and we can look at the list, and we'll know who owns the list, right? We can tell, if it's not properly curated by one of the somms you're talking about. We'll know that this is a Southern list, because they dominate. We know exactly what brands are, and that's exactly what you're saying is these wonderful brands that have come into us that allow us to experiment and teach and discuss and fawn over are going to go away. They're going to be lost, at least in the shuffle, and it's going to be that much harder to have them. You made an interesting point about the somm situation. It wasn't that long ago, and we're from the same generation, so it's I'm talking maybe early on in my career, maybe the early 90s. There were 6-digit jobs in Vegas, to be the somm of a fancy restaurant, and those jobs don't exist anymore. It's got a lot more complicated. A lot more people want to do it. But at the same time, I guess you're saying a lot of smaller restaurants brought somebody in,
yes,
to curate that list, and you do need that for that hand sell. You do need it for the Jura wines. I mean, I'm not going to walk into a restaurant and order something from Jura or Georgia, the country of Georgia. I need the somm to say, hey, here's something that we've tasted, and it's excellent. I think you're going to enjoy it based on what you told me you like. So if I'm an importer, or you and I start a winery tomorrow, what are we going to do? We're going to go to the restaurants, or we were going to go to the restaurants, because that's an annuity. Once it's on the list and the somm knows what it's there, and they've tasted it, and they go to the table and they hand sell that bottle, and then that person comes back the next time and wants it again, you and I, as a winery or a distributor, are going to say, hey, let's just put them on the list, and we don't have to make another sales call, to get that sale. Unlike here, where you have to come here every Tuesday in order for me to buy something. I think that's going to change the way wine is sold and presented. And I'm not sure what that means, but
absolutely. Another aspect, because of so many restaurants had to close down, a lot of them tried to raise money by selling off their wine list, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And, that happened with a lot of restaurants that had invested over many years into building up a deep wine list. Are those restaurants going to do that again? I don't know. I don't think we're going to see the same sorts of wine lists that we, grew to love and depend on before. And if we don't, this great diversity of wine that has been the story of the last 20 years, are we going to be able to maintain that? Both the consolidation of distributors and the crushing of the restaurant industry are working against that.
It's such a tormenting thought. At the same time, it seems like maybe as we come out of this, maybe restaurants will look different. Maybe they won't be, maybe they'll be more, in anticipation of maybe another pandemic, they'll have more patio seating, in the future, or maybe there's a larger takeout counter going forward and less people serving, or maybe, I don't know the answer to that, but it seems like we're still going to want to go out. We're still going to want to go have a good glass of wine. We're still going to want to, look at all of us. We're sort of like chomping at the bit to get out of here.
Yeah, I don't
do
think
something.
The impulse is any different. I think we all are desperate to go to restaurants. We love restaurants. And I think that we will have restaurants again. It's just going to take time to rebuild, and it may, I don't know if it takes 5 years, a decade. I really can't say, but it's
That's a
just going
tough
to
one.
take a while, and
That's a
maybe,
tough one.
it's an opportunity to create a more rational restaurant economy.
Well, as you know, being a food critic, and I want to talk about that now. The margins are really bad as a good restaurateur. If you want to do it right and you want to serve proper food and you want to have passion about what you're serving, it's not an easy business. We have a cousin here in Pasadena that's got 140 seats in Italian trattoria. And he actually was killing it during the original lockdown when we got to move outside. He ended up with 138 seats outside. He had 140 inside, and he was 25% ahead during COVID until Governor Newsom shut him down, just being outside, which I thought was a fascinating idea. And it kind of goes back. It made me reflect on Ma Maison, Pat Touret, whose idea in 1973 or 5 or whatever it was, wanted to bring the Provence to Los Angeles and just have patio dining. And I thought, wow, look, it's coming around to that sort of European model. But you were a food critic before you were a wine critic.
Yes.
It's how many years is that?
From 92 to 2004, I reviewed restaurants.
Wow, quite a long time. So now we've got COVID to deal with as far as not knowing what the path out of this for restaurants is, but you've got the regular change in cuisine and the American, the direction of food in America. And a good friend of mine is Patrick Hugh, the author of The Last Days of Haute Cuisine. It starts with the conversation about Le Pavillon and ends up with Chez Panisse. It kind of ends there.
Right.
And then we move into Michael's and all the things in LA. So isn't that a lot of pressure, between the COVID and the regular dynamic change of Americans? And I think Patrick's point in his book was restaurants reflect society's needs and wants and what we're doing. So, wow, it looks like we want outdoor dining. Is that not enough pressure on restaurants and restaurateurs?
And I'll just say that outdoor dining means something entirely different in LA than it does in New York City.
Yeah, I suppose, particularly now.
Well,
how is that though?
I mean, I'm shocked. You walk down an avenue on a 20-degree night, and there are still people dining in their cubicles, out
with the plastic.
Not all of them with heat lamps, and the desire to socialize, I guess, over food is overwhelming, that people are braving, really kind of frigid conditions to do it.
It sort of supports that idea that really restaurants do reflect the needs and wants of society and what we're eating. And tell me a little bit about that sort of change from the French, the Escoffier French in New York, which is kind of where cuisine started, and as it dynamically changed into freewheeling places like Chez Panisse and then past that. What is the current thoughts?
It's hard to say with restaurants right now, having
we don't know. I guess
almost
we don't know.
a full year since
That's true.
I've been able to go out regularly. But looking at the last 30 years or so, just in what's fascinated me is the way things get built up, broken down, built up again, but in a slightly different way. And, so you used to have a French restaurant, an Italian restaurant, an Indian restaurant, a Chinese restaurant. And one after the other, we started to realize that there's no such thing as just French or just Italian or just Chinese. You've got all kinds of regional variations, and restaurants grew to kind of reflect these differences. And then you get a kind of a nostalgia for, in the case of Italian restaurants, for the Italian American kind of cuisine that that dominated Italian restaurants for so many years, until
The
people
regulars.
started to worry about, buzzwords like authenticity and things like that. And you had restaurants like Carbone's in New York, which kind of recreated that Rat Pack feeling that Dean Martin playing over tuxedoed waiters, bringing out the scungili or whatever, kinds of dish, red sauce, all sorts of things. So
I can see it. I can see it now.
yeah. And then you have the constant inflow of immigrants bringing their foods, which at first they don't. They're just cooking it for their brethren, their fellow immigrants, and then you see wider interests, and you get to understand different aspects of Mexican cooking or Ecuadorian cooking, or different cuisines of the African diaspora. And it's just it always fascinates me. For many years I was covering these. I don't like the word ethnic foods. I prefer immigrant, because that's really, we're all ethnicities. But you saw that restaurants are just as much a question of demographics as they are of cuisine, and it's just fascinating.
It is fascinating. There was how things change, and particularly since you said immigrant fruit. My family's Armenian. My mother's was a fabulous cook, and she was toward the Turkish side of the Armenian foods, which is better, by the way, than the Iranian version, the Persian versions, in my personal opinion. Of course, my wife's from that side of the continent. So, but there was a guy.
Sides.
Yes, exactly. There was a guy, George Mardikian, who owned a restaurant in San Francisco called Omar Khayyam's, which was this fabulous restaurant for anybody to go to. And I think it's the beginning of what you're talking about, so this ethnic restaurant, because it was just, now in Glendale, California, there's probably 200 of the same restaurants. But back in the 60s and the 50s, something like this cuisine was considered pretty exotic. I mean, I read his cookbook.
Partly that was because, we didn't, as a country, permit a lot of immigration from all of these different countries that, I forget what year the laws were changed, but suddenly the U.S. opened its borders to a far greater number of countries than our very kind of Anglo-European orientation earlier in the 20th century.
Yeah,
and
he actually came on the same.
Brought food.
Yeah, and he came kind of in that situation. And actually, that's very interesting you say it that way. And I hadn't thought of that. That one of the things he did, started a group called Ancha, was when he was given the role by Dwight Eisenhower to go clean up the commissaries across the world that were American, where the troops were eating, and he became their health and food expert. So he traveled the world, went all over the world, and changed the recipes and changed the food served to the servicemen. And then when he did that, he stumbled across a concentration camp, so to speak. It was sort of they call it displaced persons camp. A bunch of Armenians were there, and he set out to transfer 10,000 interned Armenians to America. Many of them landed here in Southern California, and brought with them the Russian Armenian foods, the Napoleon desserts, and the barashkis, the fried dough with potatoes or meat. A whole cuisine came with these people to America, to Southern California, and they all opened restaurants and ones that could cook. That's a really interesting thought. I hadn't thought of that.
There somewhere.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's really interesting. Well, what do you think's going to happen then the same thing can happen in the wine business, right? I'm seeing more Caucasus wines, for instance, come to America. I'm seeing Armenian wines now that they became independent. They've doubled from 25 to 54 wineries, and they've brought technology in. I told you about tomorrow's virtual call with Vahe Kushgarian, who's one of these spearheads some of this technology changes. But do you see a renaissance of of interesting wines coming to America? Let's say
Well,
immigrant wines.
I think we've been seeing that for 30 years, and in a place like Armenia or Georgia, that very much has to do with the fall of the Soviet Union. Um, one of the things that the Soviet Union basically tried to do was to crush the ethnic identities of
Hmm.
many of its so-called republics. And in Georgia, for example, it was very much encouraged that you make a kind of bland, industrialized sort of wine when
Hmm.
the custom was basically for farmers to be making wine in their kvevery, and it was very much a family thing, and that has to be kind of recovered. And I think you've seen that in a lot of places. Georgia or Armenia, other countries like Hungary, which is not
Hmm.
dealing with other political issues, Slovenia,
Croatia.
the countries of Croatia for sure, the that whole part of northeastern Italy, Friuli, Venezia Giulia. These were areas for so many years that identities were sort of uh, it, it was hoped to try to blend in these ethnic identities into a larger whole, and people never really gave up their cultures, and you're seeing that in the variety of wines from a lot of these areas that have made a comeback.
Just tasted a super. What I taste on Tuesday is super. The guy said, I mean, there's super Sicilians have been around, which is my favorite term, was super Tuscans anyway. But a super Veneto just came through the other day, and I thought, what is this? He goes, it's Cabernet and Merlot grown in the Veneto. And I'm like, really? Okay, well, and it was, it was pretty rich actually, considering where it's from. I was fascinated by it. It just seems like an uphill battle for this whole new movement, because I love.
Well, look at Spain, for example, where Franco, for his entire reign, tried to crush the regional cultures of Spain
Hmm.
and just create it into a wider Spanish culture. And now you've had the rise of Basque wines, of Catalan wines, of
Hmm.
wines from different parts of the South, and the renaissance of wines from the Madrid area,
Hmm.
from
Hmm.
Galicia. These are all wonderful uh, wine. It's a wonderful thing of the last 30 years, and it's one of the reasons I think we live in the greatest time in history for wine, because we have access to all of these wines that you know even 30 or 40 years ago we had no idea that they even existed.
It's funny. You talked about some of these Spanish, like somebody brought in a Mencia, which I think is a fabulous wine, by the way. The good
Yes,
ones are just
I agree.
fabulous. And the poor guy, prices were fair, but I said, "How much do you have?" He goes, "Oh, I brought in a whole container." I said, "You brought a whole container of Mencia? I mean, in Southern California? I mean." So then, like a year later, he brings it back. He goes, "Yeah, I still have some." And another year, I think it took him about 3 years to move this one container, because, that's a hand sell. You've got to go out and taste
Got to
people on
build
it.
the
And
market first.
yeah, it's a tough one. You wrote a great article about Beaujolais recently, and I wanted to touch on that because um, I am fascinated by particularly aged Beaujolais, and I not feel bad, but the movement of most people, when you bring up the word Beaujolais, will think of George Duboeuf, Beaujolais Nouveau. And it's such a more sophisticated wine than that. And there's such class to it. And there's such wonderful terroir to it if you go from the north to the south. Um, how do we get that? How do we, well, let me put it this way. The winemaker Chateau de Jacques will show you a menu from 1965 somewhere in Lyon, where the Beaujolais, the Cru Beaujolais are more expensive than the Grand Cru Burgundies. So how did this happen? How do we end up where this wonderful wine sort of got itself bastardized, and now we have to come out of that hole and try and figure this thing out?
Well, I think you mentioned the two key factors, Duboeuf and Beaujolais Nouveau. Duboeuf, just a genius at marketing, turned Beaujolais Nouveau into a worldwide phenomenon. And in the 70s and in the 80s, the demand became so great that most of the growers in Beaujolais, and at that time, you didn't have a lot of estate bottling. You had a lot of people selling their grapes to the negociant, and they started making growing grapes specifically for Nouveau and specifically for the Duboeuf style, which means harvest early. Chaptalize it, play around in the cellar with it to create your wine. And when the market began to tank for Beaujolais Nouveau, the growers were kind of in a crisis. They couldn't sell their grapes. They kind of lost the ability to farm properly, and Beaujolais was in a real crisis in the late 90s and the early part of this century. And I think what you saw happen there is what you're seeing in a lot of other places in wine, where the mass production of cheap wine that sells at a very slim margin began to die, and it was replaced by very high quality wine that was a lot more expensive. Sherry is another example where, for years you had a lot of awful cheap sherry, largely marketed to the Brits. And that market began to die. And you had a great kind of crisis in southern Spain. And the solution there is to make a lot less wine, but to make a lot better wine that you can sell for more money to people who really appreciate it. Same as in Beaujolais.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I taste a lot of Beaujolais. It comes through all the time. I didn't take the time a couple of years ago to understand it. So when we were back in Beaujolais 2 years ago, when we got to sit at the table and put our hand in the soil of Moulin à Vent or Côte de Pie, and understand this, you can start to smell things. You can start the tactile representation of where the grapes were grown started to make a lot of sense as to the character of the wine. And then we tasted an aged, I think it was a 10-year-old or even more than that, Moulin à Vent. It was incredible. And so such wonderful wines that we have to sort of, and poor Cheryl Sarouge is sort of the ambassador of this movement to get the world, one bottle at a time, pretty much, to regain traction, to expose, the wine connoisseur or wine enthusiast to this things of wine. It's, you brought something up. There's two things I want to talk about because we're already at 45 minutes. It's so fascinating. But you talk about the mass-produced wines, and my listeners are tired of hearing this from me because I have to deal with this every day. But it's these these €1 liter wines coming from Europe and the 20-liter Tetra Tech tanks, and they're being bottled and sent out in all kinds of brands. I even had the other day with the blogger from punchdrink.com, the beverage blog.
Yes.
She was here tasting with me, and I said, let's open this bottle that was sent to me by a competitor, oddly. I mean, I don't know how that's how crazy this industry is. Competitors are sending me wines to taste for them. And it was really bad. Beaujolais, it was a 16 at the time. This is probably a year and a half ago. Well, it was Saturday Night Live Beaujolais. And I thought to myself, who would buy Saturday Night Live Beaujolais? And if somebody bought it, they went, oh, I love Saturday Night Live, how fun. Maybe I'll open a bottle during an episode or have my friends over, and they open it. They cannot say to themselves, well, this is really fun, because it was really, really not good. I mean, it was, so what do we do about these things?
I think that we have to recognize that a significant percentage of the people who drink wine don't care about wine.
Well, I suppose
they buy it because they are looking for, an intoxicant that tastes okay, that they can drink with their friends, that's cheap and convenient. And the percentage of wine drinkers who actually care about wine is rather small. So, you can compare it to restaurants. If you're looking at the mass of restaurant goers, probably a very high percentage of people who go to restaurants are going to fast food places or chain restaurants. It's a much smaller percentage, but a very significant fraction that keep the independent restaurant business going, that care about different cuisines and the visions of different chefs. And I think that's true with wine as well. And I think you have to separate the two elements here. You have one group that is just going to the supermarket and they're buying, whatever appeals to them. And you can see a little bit of crossover here. For example, you've read about Aveline, the new clean wine that was introduced by Cameron Diaz and her partner, and that it's a wine that got a lot of shit and it's aimed directly for the group of people who just don't care that much about wine, but they're packaging good wines. So, how do you feel about that? It's on the one hand, it's a really it's driven by marketing, but on the other hand, at least they're taking wines that seem honest in their production and not what I call processed wines, which are the wine equivalent of processed foods.
That's a great thought. You actually you just turned my mind against, which was always against celebrity-based wines, always, because it's just, they never work. I won the PGA Tour Wine Club, and that's a whole different story. The honor to be their wine club, and there were 16 golfers that had wines, and none of them have wines anymore except Greg Norman. But I think that's a really important concept you just brought up. John Legend, I have John Legend wines here at the shop. Gorgeous Cabernet made by the Raymond Vineyards, but overpriced because they got to pay some percentage to the celebrity. But I think you're right. I think it brings possibly non-wine drinkers to the table because of the celebrity status. They want to try it. They want to try Cameron Diaz's wine because it's supposedly raw, whatever. And maybe like White Zinfandel did in the 70s, bring people to the table that otherwise wouldn't have experienced wine. I think that's a really valid point, because if you ask, go ahead.
That said, I'm not one who believes in gateway wines. I think the concept of gateway wine is often used by the industry to rationalize bad wine.
That's true too.
Oh, we got to give them Yellowtail first so that they'll drink. No, but
I agree with that.
I think
totally.
Aveline is not bad wine. It's actually good wine made by good producers, even though it's got this kind of celebrity packaging, and the whole notion of clean wine is kind of bullshit. But it's not bad wine, and that's always where I draw the line.
No, but like the Saturday Night Live thing was bad, and that's the kind of thing we don't want to see people try to invest in. But her wine, like I said, the John Legend wines from Raymond, it's Jean-Charles Boisset stuff. It's very good. It's just a little overpriced. And an important point, and that's going to get me to the last subject because we're going to run out of time. But the important point is if you ask the Wine Institute of America, how many people, if you ask 100,000 people who drinks wine in America, and this goes right to what you're saying, 25,000 would raise their hand and say, yeah, I drink wine. But that does include the woman that I saw the other day at Ralph's that was buying a magnum of Sutter Home Sauvignon Blanc for $4.49. She would raise her hand, or the guy that orders the House Chianti at Olive Garden, he would raise his hand. So that's in that 25%. So you got to take that down even further to find people that would be even interested in listening to this conversation about wine. And maybe it's 5% of the people of the whole population. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to explain this to general internet marketers, affiliate people or PPC people, whatever these guys are. They come to me, we can change all your metrics and we can, you're going to make a ton of money because you use us. I said, you don't understand. 100,000 people and you get down to 5,000 people that might be interested. And so that's the next thing. And I had this conversation yesterday with Patricia Gallagher, Stephen Spurrier's old friend, about the education, the time for. My father started 2 chapters of Les Amis de Vin ici, here in Southern California back in the 70s. Obviously, l'Académie de Vin in Paris. And you have a wine school. Tell me about your wine school.
Well,
and
it's
I want
not,
to talk to you about that.
I just have a monthly column that's called Wine School.
I see. Okay.
And, it's not, I don't have paying people who are subscribing to the New York Times read.
No wonder I couldn't find any classes to take.
Yeah.
But it's important because you call it Wine School and there's information and content that obviously that's a subject we didn't even get on. But I want to talk about it.
The philosophy is that the best way to learn about wine is to drink a lot of different wines. And I thought, now that with high-speed internet, we can do kind of an interactive column in which each month I essentially assign a genre of wines and suggest a few different bottles and people go out and drink them. And then we kind of gather again at the end of the month and talk about the wines. And the idea is not for me to get up and tell people what they ought to think about the wines, but for everybody to drink them, not taste, but drink. And decide for themselves how they feel about the wines. And the subtext is that by doing this with enough different wines, exposing people to a real diversity of wines, people begin to develop their own taste, get a sense of what they like, what they don't like, in real terms, not, oh, I like oaky wines, or I like the Chardonnay from the Mâconnais region, or I like this Malbec from Mendoza, or get a real sense of what they like, and also begin to feel confident about their own opinions, and
that's it.
In a sense, rely less on authorities telling them whether a wine is good or bad and what they ought to like.
The scoring system. We have so much to talk about, and we're going to run out of time here. And I want to just bounce one thing off of you, and I hope we can do this again because we have that alone could take us an hour. But this idea of les amis de vin, I want to start it here, and I just actually applied for the trademark. And I want to bring it back. And I don't know what it looks like yet. When my dad was doing it, they had Mondavi would come down and Bowser would speak and Nathan Croman and these guys would all come to the South Bay here in Southern California, and they would speak to a bunch of enthusiasts. And my dad being a wine shop proprietor, that was important. Jim Barrett, Jim Barrett was our neighbor. He would grab them, they'd go down to taste together. So, and I want to do that again. And I don't know what it looks like yet. I'm going to probably send you some emails and start asking you some questions, because it's a nonprofit thing. It's wine enthusiasts. It's doing exactly what you're saying, helping people find their palate through a variety of tastings, dinners, access to classes. I don't want to put on the classes. I don't want to host them necessarily, but I mean, there's so many now on the internet, and there's so many places you go, the San Francisco Wine School and various places that we could send them to. as a group. Maybe it's $25 a year to belong to the Les Amis de Vin, but I want to formulate what something like that looks like to the public and how.
In my opinion, what comes first is the interest. So you want people to be interested in wine. And how do you become interested in wine? You either fall in love with the actual drinking of it, or you become interested because somebody told you need to, whether it's a boss or a client or
Yeah.
so how does it,
You're drinking wine.
what's more effective there? To fall in love with wine because you've had a few that you love and want to learn about, or because you feel obliged to learn about it because if you're going to be meeting with clients, you better know something about it. You don't want to embarrass yourself. I think it's much more effective to fall in love with wine first than it is to do it out of fear or
So find that aha moment that everybody in this industry has at some point.
Yeah, and that's why my idea is just drink it in a way that it's meant to be consumed. Drink a lot of different wines with meals, with your family or friends, and really kind of enjoy the culture of wine. And if that's all you ever do, that's fine. But maybe it piques your interest and you want to learn a little bit more. Let's talk about that. Here's a book that you can read. I mean, people learn a lot better when they're really interested rather than feel obliged to do something.
I agree. The subject will never run out, and when you stumble across something that's interesting, that piques your interest, and you want to develop it further,
you know what it's like if you are a father, and you are trying to get your child to learn how to play tennis, and you force them to take lessons, and
they hate it.
It's never going to work.
Right.
But
that's right.
If they come to you and say, I really want to play tennis, can you help me? Then you have somebody who's going to do the work because they're interested.
That's true. It's coming on an hour, and I just really appreciate your time today, Eric. And I hope we can do it again because I didn't even get below the fold here on all the things I wanted to touch with you because your credentials and your experience and your point of view is fascinating to hear and to exchange with. I appreciate the time. I hope you stay warm and stay safe. Yes, it'd be a lot of fun I won't even get into the subjects. We can talk about it. Thank you again. Stay safe. And just to throw this out there, I have this new term. It's called vaccine envy. And there's now become the social status about what level of vaccine, which vaccine you got, and whether you're on one or two. And my wife and I were just vaccinated because she takes care of her 90-year-old plus parents. And whenever now I bring it up, they go, "Oh, you got vaccinated. Level 1 or level 2?" And
I'm
which one is
forward
it?
to any of them.
Moderna. How is that as we wrap this up? What's going on in New York with the distribution?
It's a mess. I mean, there's not nearly enough vaccine for all the people who are qualified for it, and they keep adding people who are permitted to get vaccines, but there's just not enough around.
That's terrible. Do they have more than one style out there, like the Moderna? This is again part of our society now.
No idea
what it is. Yeah.
I'm assuming it's either Pfizer or Moderna, but I don't know.
Well, after our second shot, which is in a month, and then you got to wait another 3-4 weeks. But my daughter's pregnant. She lives in the Manhattan Village, and she's having a baby at the end of this month. And so my wife and she would not let us come out to see her unless we were completely in the clear, so to speak. So we'll be out there probably in April, and maybe we have a glass of wine together. In the meantime,
if it's warm enough to do it outdoors.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yes.
Well, happy to get you back on the show in a little bit. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Paul.
Cheers.
Take care.